Hey everybody, how's it going? And welcome back to Reading in the Dark. Byron here. This is going to be my Spookathon wrap-up video. That's weird to me, but believe it or not, Spookathon was over several days ago, which is insane to me. And it is going to be November soon, which is both crazy and sad. For Spookathon, I read 7 books, something that I am very proud of. I've never finished a readathon before, and in fact I've done readathons with only 5 books in them and didn't finish those. Now granted, 3 of the books that I read for Spookathon were short and they were illustrated. They were the Scary Stories books by Alvin Schwartz, but I'm still counting it because they're books. The other 4 were more booky books, longer books. They were all about 300 pages, which is actually still rather short. What I did was I staggered the Scary Stories books in between these 4. So I did like regular book, Scary Stories book, regular book, Scary Stories book, regular book, Scary Stories book, regular book. So that's what I did, but I'm gonna just kind of lump them all together at the end of this video instead of going back and forth. The first book that I read for Spookathon fulfilled the challenge to read a thriller, read any thriller, and originally I had selected A Density of Souls by Christopher Rice, which is a book that I have been putting off, and it keeps getting sort of shoved away because The Haunting of Hill House is on Netflix, and I keep hearing it's great, and I want to watch it, but I want to read it first. So I thought, okay, you know what? I'm going to swap that out for my thriller. So I read The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley, which everybody, that I follow on BookTube has already read and loves, for my thriller. And I loved The Haunting of Hill House. I gave it 4 stars. It was just beautifully written. It's relatively short. It's about a young woman who's very, very naive and sheltered from the world, named Eleanor, who is found by a sort of paranormal investigator guy because she lived through a strange kind of paranormal situation when she was a younger girl, to join this small group of people that he has staying for a few days in Hill House, which is supposed to be a haunted mansion, basically. And he wants to go there and stay for a few days with people who are more aware, perhaps, of elements from the other side, so that he can study to see what's up with the haunted house, if it's really haunted, what's going on in there, and whatnot. She's a very naive and very adorable sort of character in how she's written. The beginning of the book I loved because it was all about her taking her car that she owns with her sister against her sister's wishes and driving way out to where the house is located. And she just has a ball driving through the countryside and seeing trees and flowers and like buildings and just stuff on the sides of the road. And she just is sort of feeling the expansive world for the first time on her own. And she's so excited. And she has all these crazy fantasies and daydreams, making up stories about like what she's driving past and stuff. And that whole first section of the book just had me enraptured. I thought she was the most wonderful character. I loved reading and being inside her head. She was so sweet, and she had such lovely ideas. And then she got to the mansion and she met the other people. I loved the atmosphere in the mansion inside Hill House. I was very cozy, and it was very, what you would expect. It was very creepy, very dark, but in a very gothic sort of like enjoyable way, not in like a gritty, disgusting way. She had a very interesting relationship with the other woman who was staying there for this experiment named Theodora. There were moments when they were such foils for each other in terms of her being timid and Theodora was a lot more like outspoken and stuff, that I almost started to question whether Theodora was a real character or if this was like a Fight Club situation. I loved reading their relationship, and it took some interesting turns. The depictions of the occasional run-ins that they had with the ghostly aspects of the house were just vague enough to be trippy, and I wasn't totally sure what was happening, but I was able to follow, and I loved hearing the backstory and the history of the house. It was all just fascinating. It was wonderfully told, like ghost story. The ending was absolutely everything I dreamed it would be. It was perfect. So I really loved this book. I mean, I have a hard time giving out 5-star ratings lately for some reason. I don't know why. I just didn't feel that extra something to give this 5 stars, but I loved this book. So the first read of Spookathon was a huge success. So the next sort of full-length book that I read was Heartbreaker by Claudia Dey. This fulfilled the read a book with purple on the cover challenge. Now this book wasn't exactly spooky. It's really a book about a woman who lives in this sort of settlement, they call it, It's basically a cult, and they live removed from the rest of society. They don't know what year it is. They think it's the 80s, but it's actually like 2018. And this woman showed up in a kind of a wrecked car in a really terrible state many years ago. She was an outsider, but then she ended up becoming a part of the community, and she married a man and had a daughter. And you get to know this woman through a narration that comes from 3 different sources. The book is split into 3 pieces. The first section is narrated by her daughter. The second section is narrated by her dog. And the third section is narrated by a boy who lives in town, who's her daughter's age. The first section was really funny and reminded me quite a bit of Ottessa Moshfegh's writing, probably because it was sort of this sort of like grumpy, disaffected, younger, like teenage girl. The second section was so lovely. It was written from the perspective of the dog, as I said, and it just like works because the writer, Claudia Dey, she wrote the dog with intelligence. She didn't try to write like dog type thoughts. Like it wasn't like a chapter full of like, I'm hungry, where's the food? It was like interesting insights into the character of this woman, because this dog, as most dogs are, was always just focused on her. And it was just like reading any character's internal narration who just happens to be a character that can't speak. Oh, I just thought it was so kind of bold to do that, and it worked so well. And then the third section was written from the perspective of the boy, and I'm not going to get into that too much because I don't want to get into spoiler territory, but I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was so cleverly written. The format of the book worked like gangbusters, sort of getting the portrait of this woman without her ever being the narrator. And it was just a fascinating portrayal of this community and their culture, and I just loved the way it was written, and I really enjoyed it. It challenged me because the world that it was creating was so unusual. I would recommend it. Again, it was not really spooky, but it was really, really very good. And it was one of the more unique things I've read since I started reading again, and I gave it 4 stars. The third big book that I read, again, not big, the third regular-sized novel that I read was Slade House by David Mitchell. Now, this was my answer to the challenge to read a book that takes place in a different time period. Slade House is set in England, and it's basically a haunted house story about this very large home in the middle of the city that is behind this wall and behind this gate in this alley. You can't imagine that there's going to be any home beside on the other side of the wall that is as big as Slade House is. And then you go through the gate and you see this big garden and you see this huge house and you're like, how does this fit in here? And every 9 years they have a guest. It's, they bring someone in and then that person is never seen or heard from again. I enjoyed the hopping time period aspect of this book, and I liked the depiction of people, their visit to the house. I liked all of the setting, and I liked the writing itself. I will say, though, this was the most disappointing read of my Spookathon, just in that I didn't love the ending. I thought it was a little bit too explainy, and because it's a ghost story, the fact that he kind of explains everything, for me it became a little cheesy. It just wasn't totally for me in the end, and although I enjoyed the book, it's not my favorite ghost story that I've ever read, and I gave it 3 stars. So Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad is a book that really challenged me. And it is a book that I said in my vlog, I don't completely understand what I read yet, and I'm going to have to reread it. It's considered a classic and people think it's brilliant. So, hey, maybe it is. I enjoyed this book. I was challenged by it, and it was, as a lot of people on Goodreads have said, it was difficult to get through. It is very short. It's about 100 pages. I think this tells the story of a man who is a captain of a ship. They work for a company that is going up the Congo River, plundering the ivory, and they're in search of this other captain, one of the most successful, who has kind of gone AWOL and nobody knows where he is or what has happened to him. This book draws this intense contrast and comparison between all of these European white people and all of the indigenous people there who they see as savages and animals. It's told from the perspective of a narrator who is very, very ignorant and uses the N-word to describe the indigenous people several times. The depiction is very, very unflattering, very, very ignorant, very, very disturbing and dark and really awful and vile. And yet that is the perspective of the character. It's just an interesting commentary on colonialism. Heart of Darkness is sort of analyzing what are the inherent differences, if any, between people who live in these so-called civilized societies and human beings who live outside of that world. And is there any difference? And I think the answer is no, there isn't. That there is inherently a lot of evil or potential for evil doing and darkness in the heart of every man, regardless of where you are from. So it's an amazing book. It's an amazing book. It's dense, it's hard to read, but it's fascinating. It's not going to be for everybody. This book has a lot to say about the inherent nature of man. Are we inherently good or inherently evil? You have to wade through a lot of crap to get to that point. I guess what I learned from reading this is that it is okay to not completely grasp a book after you read it the first time. This book is just challenging for me. I gave it 3 stars because it was so hard to get through and because there were elements of it that were so distasteful and upsetting to read. That said, I haven't stopped thinking about it since I read it. And I really think that it actually has some pretty amazing things to say about the human condition. And I'm very, very confused by it. And I can't stop thinking about it. So I think I'm raising my rating to 4 stars. And I need to reread it, and maybe it'll go back down again. Maybe it'll go up. It's sitting at 4 stars right now. So that is the end of the 4 full-length novels that I read, which leaves the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark anthology. So I read all 3 of Scary Story books. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and Scary Stories 3, More Tales to Chill Your Bones. All of these books, as we know, are collected by Alvin Schwartz from folklore and other sources, and illustrated by Stephen Gammell. This series was re-released several years ago with new illustrations that were a lot tamer, because back in the day, these books were some of the most banned books in schools. Primarily, I think, because of not only the dark nature of the stories themselves, but the illustrations. These are just old stories. Most of them are very, very short, about, ghosts and hauntings and people getting their, comeuppance from people from the other side when they do something wrong. Yeah, and I grew up with these books, like so many people around my age. My favorite book, the one that I remember the most, is the second one, More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. But I remember some stories from the first one as well. Most people that I know, when I bring up this book, they go, oh my God, those books made my childhood. I remember being a Boy Scout and being in a tent with my friend Chris and reading him the story Clickety Clink from More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and him being scared, and I was a jerk, and I kept reading it anyway. And that is a story about a gravedigger who robs the silver coins off of the eyes of this dead woman who he's burying. And she, as a ghost, comes after him that evening, and he keeps hearing the sound of the coins, which he has placed in a tin cup on his dresser. When he goes to bed, they start clinking around in the cup. And then the door opens, and the ghost of the dead woman is there. And the illustrations are just terrifying and just amazing. It's amazing that these books were made for kids with illustrations like this. But frankly, if they hadn't been that scary, I wouldn't remember these books, which is why the re-release was such a horrible thing to do, in my opinion. And also is then, I'm sure, why the original illustrations have been restored in the new edition that I bought, which was a box set of all 3 paperbacks. So I love these stories. That said, I think the first collection and the second collection are a lot stronger than the third one. I just can't really rate these books. I think I did on Goodreads. I know I gave, the first book 4 stars, the second book 5 stars, and the third book 3 stars. So my favorite stories from these 3 collections were The Big Toe, The Girl Who Stood on a Grave, and High Beams from the first book. From More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, I had a lot because this was my favorite book. Something Was Wrong, The Wreck, Somebody Fell from a Loft, Clickety Clink, The Bride, and The Bed by the Window. And in the third book, I really enjoyed 2 stories, Harold and Such Things Happen. These stories are all very easy to read. They're for kids. And they just take you to a really fun place, and they bring me back to my childhood. I just had a really great time reading them. I read them in between the other books. It was like coming home again to read these stories. They're still chilling, and there's still something cozy and almost oddly comforting in the stories, because a lot of them are about people coming back from the other side to right a wrong or to confront the bad guy. I suppose ghost stories are comforting to us all in that they sort of confirm the existence of an afterlife. And as a kid, I suppose that's comforting in its own way, even if we don't realize it at the time. The illustrations hold up. They're still scary and creepy and amazing after all these years. These books were from my childhood, and I just love them, and I had a wonderful time rereading them, and I'm thrilled that I own them again. And that concludes the 7 books that I read for Spookathon. So having read all of these books, I have to say I think probably the 2 books that I would call my favorites from this challenge would be The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Haunting of Hill House is just a perfect thriller. And I guess I'm going to say Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, because although I didn't love the experience of reading it, I know I have to reread it, and I feel like I'm learning something from having read it, and it was really fascinating. And obviously the Scary Stories books are too, but I already knew those. So those are my favorites from this readathon, and I had a great time doing this, and I'm thrilled that I finished it. Now I'm just going to get back to enjoying Dracula. I thank you all for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button down below. And if you'd like to see more content like this, perhaps consider subscribing to my channel. And until next time, I will be here in the dark reading. Bye, guys.